Hello and welcome. Today we are looking at multiple new decks that have sprouted out from the new Tarkir decks. And maybe they are not that new, maybe they have been revamped. Some have been twice as strong, even while they were already Pro Tour decks. So really exciting stuff here coming from this new set that just improves on what has been done before, mostly. Let's start with the first one, Ords of Engines, and I think this wasn't really a deck in the previous format, necessarily, but it had so many pieces already. I mean, Elas Il-Kor, which gives you life, drains opponents of life for every time creatures enter or when they leave. We had Bloomburrow with cards like Hinterland Sanctifier that gave you a life whenever another creature entered the battlefield. So you really already had a great control outlook upon this. We gained Raise the Past, which returns all creature cards with mana value 2 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. I think there are some more Tarkir cards that could have been in here, but are just a bit too expensive. Because look at how low curvy you are. Most cards are 1 or 2 mana, and you will easily dispatch those cards if you need to. Also, I think it's fun that you have Vengeful Blood Witch, for example, in this deck, next to Dewdrop Cure, or maybe the Hinterland Sanctifier next to the Elas Il-Kor, which are just too far away from each other lore-wise. New in the deck, we have Avenger of the Fallen, which is a 3-mana Death Touch that mobilizes X, so you get a bunch of 1/1 attacking red warrior creature tokens, which you do have to sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step, so you do get to attack with them, and then at the end of the turn you must sacrifice them. But we don't care because we want to sacrifice those creatures, and every time we do sacrifice one of those creatures, we will drain our opponents for a bunch. Starscape Cleric, for example, says whenever you gain life, each opponent loses a life. So with Hinterland Sanctifier, you will get a bunch of 1/1s entering the battlefield, gain a bunch of life, and then drain your opponents for a bunch, maybe with Elas Il-Kor as well. But there are so many ways in which you can drain your opponents, and the mobilized mechanic really took this deck and put it all together and made it a good one. We also have Rot Curse Raksha. Another small guy, you wouldn't expect this, but it's a 5/5. Doesn't work with Mobilize necessarily, but has Decayed. So it cannot block, and when it attacks, it sacrifices itself at the end of combat. But a 2-mana guy that can deal 5 damage with Trample will already be really good in this deck, because when it dies, when it enters, you will get a bunch of stuff as well. And you will, of course, deal a bunch of damage, and you will need that sort of reach for this deck. Then when it is dead, you can renew it. So for 2 black mana and X, you exile it from your graveyard, put a Decayed counter on each of X target creatures, and then you activate it only as a sorcery. But then you can make your opponent's creatures a bunch weaker. And we have the Voice of Victory, which also has Mobilize, which we love. But I think this next ability is maybe one of the most overrated ones. Underrated, sorry. Your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. So that means that you are safe to do whatever you want to do. And this can be really frustrating for your opponent when you are storming off with all of those enter the battlefield, leave the battlefield, and whatever triggers. So you have a big engine, and you can protect yourself from the spells of your opponents during your own turn, which is when you will be doing everything. So that is why this card is really good in this deck. And I think it's also really lovely that you have so many new flavorful cards, because for the Mardu, it is really special to now have music at all. Maybe it is during battle, or it's just the Voice of Victory, but having music at all means that the Mardu have gotten their culture back, and they are not just about raising everything down. They might now also be about enjoying the victory that you had and making each other proud. So there's a big difference in this mechanic, so you get to learn all of that from this deck too. which might not be expected from an Orzhov deck. Next is Yugin, which has really changed up, made a new deck, I think, green pure ramp. So the goal is the ramp. You have a bunch of cards like Llanowar Elves giving you 1 mana for 1 mana. We have Hedron Archive, which is pretty good here, which gives you 2 colorless mana because you have a bunch of colorless threats in this deck. And the biggest threat that you will put out is Sire of 7 Deaths from the Foundation set. It's a 7 mana, 7/7 with 7 keywords sort of on there. It has First Strike, Vigilance, Menace, Trample, Reach, Lifelink, and Ward. So this is definitely a great way to swing the game into your favor. For one, people have to block 2 with 2 of their creatures. It has First Strike, so it will probably kill those creatures. It has Vigilance, so then it can defend yourself afterwards. It can even defend against flyers with its Reach. It has Trample, so it cannot really be stopped. And it has Ward to pay 7 life, so you will at least deal 7 life if it is targeted. And it has Lifelink, so swings are really in your favor. But I think Hugin really put this deck and, put it together again. It's really the glue for this deck. Because when you cast this spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. So it's 7 mana to exile 1 permanent that's 1 or more colors. So that isn't really good yet. But then whenever you cast a colorless spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. Really making this deck into a great control deck. And you can be really fast getting it Hugin out on turn 4, 3, I think. It's possible, but 4 should be possible with this deck with how much ramp there is in here. And then you can already start picking off your opponent's stuff. They won't be able to do anything. And then when you get the Sire of 7 Deaths out, maybe by ultimating Hugin, you will win. So that's the way this control deck actually works. So it's pure ramp, but it's also a weird kind of control. Really, you should be stopped before you can get to that 7 mana point. Then we have one of the Pro Tour decks that, just got 1 new card from Tarkir. It's the Sun Pro Kirin. Look at this cutie being chased by a Jeskai boat in the air. And the Jeskai actually have a saying that that just says to chase the Kirin, which means doing something that you shouldn't do. And I think this also says a lot about the Jeskai and how they have changed, because as a blue-white faction, they would have never chased the Kirin. But now, when they have red mana added to them, I think they do want to chase the Kirin. They want to do it and just find out what happens. But for this deck, I think, it kind of adds more than you think. It's a 2 mana simple card that has flash, flying, and then most importantly, when it enters, return up to 1 target non-land card permanent you control to its owner's hand, so to your hand. That means that, for example, you can play Hopeless Nightmare, which I think is one of the main cards in this deck. Then when it enters, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life. So you will be able to do this over and over. And then there are multiple cards like this that enter and do something that's bad for them. Like Momentum Breaker, which has them sacrifice a creature or vehicle of their choice. Or discard a card if they cannot do that. So there are a bunch of things that you can do. Something else is that whenever an enchantment enters, other cards in this deck trigger, like Optimistic Scavenger. And the problem really was, and that's why it's called the Esper Pixie or Orzhov Pixie deck, that there's just 1 Pixie. So it is a 1 mana card that does the same as the Sun Pro Kirin in this deck. And now basically you have double as much, and I think this deck really wants to play both as a 4-off, and it really does. So this deck got twice as good, I would say. Something else is the Orzhov Pixie deck, which is basically the same thing. And it did basically the same thing with Tarkir, which is having Sun Pro Kirin as a doubler of the Nurturing Pixie. Then some different cards. This one in a Mardu Reanimator deck. I'm saying Mardu, but there are blue and green colors in this deck as well. But really you are not playing those lands, so it features around the Mardu colors, mostly red and black even. And what you want to do in this deck is discarding cards so that you have the cards you want in your graveyard and then returning them to the battlefield. For example, Zombify, return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield for 4 mana. And that 4 mana point is when you want to do all of your stuff. Rite of the Moth, same thing, return target card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Is what's most important about it. And then of course you want big cards that you can put into the graveyard, like Atraxa or Urani, which is a new one from Tarkir. And Urani says flying, protection from white and black, and it is a 10/10. So it is just a really big attacker usually. And when it enters, it deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers, where X is the number of lands you control. I don't think you will have too many lands in this deck, as you are mostly Rakdos. But just having a 10/10 that can attack is great for this deck and should be able to help you finish the game. So there are multiple things that you want to do. Maybe Valgavoth, maybe Urani, Atraxa is one option. And then you will have or need a bunch of ways to draw and discard. So that is where Thursa Lightshatter also comes in. A haste creature that says, when she enters, discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards. Whenever Thursa attacks, if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you exile a card at random from your graveyard and you may play that card this turn. You do have to pay for it then, so that is a little bit of a drawback here. But what you mostly want to use Thursa for in this deck is discarding as many cards as you want, basically all of your big guys, and then draw new cards that can help you discard and draw again, or that can help you get cards back onto the battlefield. Mardu Siegebreaker, I have it just here. Mardu Siegebreaker is another card that helps in this way. When this enters, exile up to 1 target creature you control until this creature leaves the battlefield. Well, this is actually a bit of a twist on the deck. And whenever this creature attacks, for each opponent create a tapped token that's a copy of the exiled card attacking that opponent. At the beginning of your end step, you sacrifice those tokens. And that is exactly why Urani gets bumped up in power here as well. Because you can exile it, then attack with it over and over, and you get that enter the battlefield effect multiple times. Something else that the Mardu Siegebreaker breaks is Etali, because it says when it enters the battlefield, each player exiles cards from the top of the library until they exile a non-land card, and you may cast any number of spells from among them without paying their mana costs. So mostly you care about it being a big creature, but also about its enter the battlefield effect. And that is really a big part of this card. And that is why Mardu Siegebreaker breaks that Etali card. Then we have Golgari Beans. And this is one that really got a bunch of cards. I think this really works around the dragon mechanic of, for one, having a spell and a creature on the card. But for the second thing that you really love is the Dragonstorm cards. It has just 2 one-offs of these, but it might be enough to really value your opponents out of the game. So what this deck is about mostly is it's about Up the Beanstalk, which has when it enters the battlefield and whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, you draw a card. So there are multiple ways in which you can sort of break this, because you play a card that has more mana value for cheaper. For example, you did this with the Overlords, which have impending something, and then, for example, 3 mana to play it, but then you would only get the Overlord in 4 turns, or at least 4 end steps. So that means that when you play the 3 mana impending spell, you also get to draw your card. So that was what is really strong about this. And then the Golgari part here is that it is just more about controlling the board and destroying artifacts, maybe exiling some stuff, maybe exiling some enchantments. So it is really also focused on defeating other Up the Beanstalk decks. So it is really, well, it hopes to be in a format where this is the only deck, I think. But it also works with those dragons. So multiple new tools that we have gotten here. First of all, we have the Dragonstorm cards. The Corroding Dragonstorm is 2 mana. Each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life, and you Surveil 2. So you can get new cards into your graveyard as well, which you, for example, might be able to get out with the Overlord of the Bilmurk. And then when a dragon you control enters, you return this enchantment to its owner's hand. So play a Scavenger Regent, and you will get it back to your hand, the Dragonstorm, and then you will be able to play it again. Caustic Exile is a card that gets stronger when you have a dragon somewhere, so you might have it on the battlefield or in your hand. You need to show it to your opponents, so you do show them a bit of your hand, of course. And then target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. If you don't show a dragon, it will cost 2 mana. That's the only drawback here. So it's good against aggressive decks, of course. And then another Dragonstorm, which is the Encroaching Dragonstorm. 4 mana to get 2 lands onto the battlefield tapped. So a bit of a high cost, but as you can do this over and over, you will be able to run away with the game here because you have more lands. And you will be able to more quickly play all the spells you have. Then for the dragons, we have the Scavenger Regent, which can be board wipe. It says each non-dragon gets -X/-X until end of turn, where it's just 2 black and X to pay for it. And then later you can play this as a 4 mana 4/4 with flying and a bit of protection. The Saga Wildling, which can search a library for a basic land, put it into your hand. So not really ramp, but can help you find the lands that you need, maybe, if that's a thing. In a 2-color deck. And then later you can play it as a 5 mana 3/3 with flying. So a bit less impressive as a body itself, but you also gain 3 life. Then the Disruptive Stormbrood, which can be a removal spell for 2 mana. You can destroy a target creature with 3 power or less. And then for 5 mana it can also be a 3/3, but it also destroys an artifact or enchantment. So again, good against other Up the Beanstalk decks. Then Bloomvine Regent, which is a big dragon 2, a bit more of a body here again. I think just like the Scavenger Regent, but now for 5. And whenever it enters or another dragon you control enters, you gain 3 life. So also it's a bit of a lord for the other dragons. And for 3 mana you can search a library for 2 basic forests, put one onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand. So it is a direct upgrade to many ramp cards that we see in Commander. And that was it for the new cards here, I think. Yeah. So next up, we have Jeskai. It's about playing the big eye, the abhorrent Oculus. 3 mana has the drawback that as an additional cost to play this, you exile 6 cards from your graveyard. But it also has the ability to give you new cards from the top of your deck. So at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you manifest Dread, which means you get a 2/2, which is one of the 2 cards face down onto your battlefield as a 2/2 for that moment. It is also a 5/5 with flying, so it can clog up the board, it will attack your opponents, and therefore it is a really expensive mythic. But to get away from the additional cost of exiling 6 cards from your graveyard, you have a bunch of recursion that works on 3 mana value or less cards, like Helping Hand, which does this exactly. Recommission is another example. And then you will need a bit of control with Torch the Tower, stuff like that. And then you will be discarding a bunch of cards. So Prof's Eidetic Memory, for example, draws a card and you have no maximum hand size. This also works in this deck because you are drawing a bunch of cards. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, put X +1 counters on target creature where X is the number of cards you've drawn. So that also strengthens, for example, the Spyglass Siren, which is a 1 mana 1/1 with flying, and could easily get as strong as the Oculus in this deck. Other discard draw is Fear of Missing Out, which discards and then draws. And Inti, which whenever it attacks, you may discard a card, put a +1 counter on target attacking creature, And then whenever you discard one or more cards, you exile the top card of your library and you may play it until the end of your next end step. So new cards here are, again, Thursa Lightshatter. Really cool here with that lightning grabbing ability. She, of course, well, in the story, she got up to a mountain, as you, I think, can see better here. She got up to a mountain and really got the soul of the Mardu into her and then grabbed that lightning, and now she is a famous person in her clan. But what she's famous for here, again, is discarding 2 cards and then drawing that many cards. So you can also discard 1 if you need both cards. So this is really flexible, which I think people really love here. And just 3 mana to discard 2 and draw 2 is already pretty good. But then you have a 3/3 with haste on top of that. And in this deck, I think it is really feasible to use the second ability as well, which we didn't see in the previous deck Thursa was in. But whenever she attacks, if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you exile 1 at random and you may play it this turn. Meaning you can also just easily get one of those helping hands back or stuff like that. So this really helps you get that stayability in your deck. Winter Night Stories is one that is in multiple decks now. It's 3 mana to draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard a creature card. So draw 3 and discard 2 or 1 if you discarded a creature. Then for 5 mana you can get this back. You would say that's a lot of mana, but you can also tap a creature and reduce the amount of mana that you have to pay by the amount of power that the creature had, that you tapped. So maybe you have gotten a big creature that you can tap now because of Prof's Eidetic Memory, or you can play this for 1 mana if you tap the Abhorrent Oculus, but not really saying that you should. Maybe it's just a 2 power creature that you tap, and then it will again be just 3 mana to play the Winter Night Stories, and it will be a pretty good card. Mostly in this deck because you can get most discarded cards back as well, with Inti or with Thursa, of course. And then another new one is the Glacial Dragonhunt, which we will get to in a bit of a moment too. But here it's just a 2 mana, draw a card, discard a card, maybe deal 3 damage, and then it has that same Harmonize ability. Other deck uses sort of the same setup, but is it Boiler Room is what I call this deck. It's a card that is just about drawing discarding, of course, and then you will be able to strengthen a bunch of cards because of it. Mostly because you are playing a bunch of 1 mana, 2 mana instants and sorceries, and maybe you are getting even more into the graveyard. Tolarian Terror is one of the finishers sort of in this deck. It's a 7 mana 5/5, but it gets 1 cheaper for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. So you can already see why having a bunch of 1 mana or 2 mana instants and sorceries is good here. But you can also see why it's good to discard them, because then your Tolarian Terror will get cheaper. Storm Chase's talent is great here because it will create a bunch of 1/1s with prowess. A bunch of them because you have 4 of these talents, I mean. And then later you can return an instant or sorcery, and then you will actually get a bunch of 1/1s with prowess at the 6 mana part, because then when you have level 3, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you create one of those 1/1s with prowess, and then you will definitely go off. We have Stock Up in a bunch of decks already. It is a 3 mana sorcery that has you choose 2 cards from the top 5 of your library and put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Really good to get those cards that you need. And then we have Sleight of Hand that opt to fill out that 1 mana draw stuff slot in your deck. Harv Elemental really works well here too, because it is a big guy that says this spell costs X less to cast, where X the number of cards in your graveyard that are instants, sorceries, or have an adventure. But basically works the same as the Tolarian Terror, and also has a sorcery adventure itself. And that's basically the most important about this deck. We have the Winter Night Stories again, doing the same thing as the previous deck. We have the Glacial Dragonhunt, which also does the same thing here as in the previous deck. And then we have some new ones. We have the Unending Whisper, which is a 1 mana sorcery that just draws a card. But we really want those 1 mana sorceries, so this is already pretty good for us. And really we don't usually care about the harmonized part, but it is really easy to get those 5 power onto the battlefield, because we have the Tolarian Terror and we have 4 power in the Hearth Elemental. So it's really easy to cast it again, but usually I think you don't really do that. The Glacial Dragon Hunt is extra good here because you will want to discard non-land cards in this deck. You want your lands in your hand, usually here. And you don't care about discarding an opt because it basically did the same. And you definitely don't care about discarding an Unending Whisper because then it really is the same. And then we have the Cori Steel Cutter, which is new and really should be in more decks. It is a great aggressive version of a card that is maybe the same role as the Storm Chaser's Talent, which is why I think it's a 4-off here. It's 2 mana for a +1/+1 equipment that also gives trample and haste, I think most importantly. And then whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you create a 1/1 and may attach the Cori Steel Cutter to that 1/1, meaning you get a 2/2 with trample, haste and prowess. So it was already an otter basically, but now it also has haste and trample. So with all of the 1 mana spells that you will play, these will get really big, and I think this is a great addition to this deck. And I think that's the most fun way to play an aggressive deck. Not just mono red or Cruel Mice, but with a bit of a twist like here. One of the coolest additions, I think, to the decks that we have in Standard is this one. And it's mostly because of Shiko, but there are multiple things that we have added here. Like the Morang River Regent and Coil and Catch, which really work well with the control pieces in this deck. So there are multiple things: Lightning Helix, Get Lost, things to remove 1 piece, maybe some board wipes are in here as well, Day of Judgment of course, and the Temporary Lockdown, which love to be bounced by the Morang River Regent. But really this is not the most interesting piece of control that we have gotten here. I think the best one is Shiko, Paragon of the Way. And I mean, it is objectively because it really works with 3 Blind Mice. 3 Blind Mice is a card that first makes 1/1/1. You need this though. It's a really important part of this ability. Then the second and third chapter allow you to create a copy of a token that you have, but it could be itself as long as it is a token, and that will help you multiply and multiply. Other things that you love to bounce are, for example, Beza, which of course will give you all of those triggers that you love. And then there are multiple options of things to bounce here. But Shiko says something really interesting. They say, when it ends the battlefield, if you may target a card from your graveyard, you may copy it, then you may cast a copy without paying its mana cost. The only thing that you need here is that it is a thing with mana value 3 or less. But 3 Blind Mice is a card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard if you have it there. So make sure that you can put it into your graveyard, for example, with a stock up, and then you can use Shiko to get that 3 Blind Mice back, and you will copy it, meaning that you get it as a token. Because it says a copy of a permanent spell becomes a token. And we love that part because then we can copy the 3 Blind Mice with a 3 Blind Mice. And that will mean that we go sort of infinite every turn, creating more 3 Blind Mice cards, creating more mice as well, and eventually flooding the board with a bunch of small token dudes. So that's it for these, for the additions from Tarkir that we have gotten. By the way, fabulous hair, don't you think? But let me know what you think about these videos and what you'd like to change. Maybe you want less of them. I only showed you the new ones. Maybe you want to see the old ones as well. And otherwise, I wish you a nice day. Thank you for watching. Bye.